welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. I am Shaun Haney, your host here today. RealAg Live is where we take your questions and we get to as many of them as we possibly can. If you do have a question, make sure you leave it in the comment box below, whether you're watching on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook. Today's guest is Deb Campbell of Agronomy Advantage, based out of Ontario. Hey, Deb, how's it going?
Good, Shaun. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing fantastic. Thanks a lot for joining us here today. I really do appreciate it. I know you're super busy walking fields, seeing what's going on out there. There's a lot of good stuff when we compare, the start of 2020 versus 2019, which is a year that we'd probably like to forget, right?
For sure. No, it's easy sailing, really easy sailing compared to last year, and crops are actually in good shape. There's a few little things happening, but no big concerns out there, so it's kind of nice.
Yeah, I got it on the, just hold on. I got it on the floor here. I had to pick up the piece of paper. Matt Pott of Grain Perspectives was reporting that as of Sunday, about 97% of the Ontario corn planted and about 88% of beans. Would you tend to agree with that?
Yes, I think even through this area that I work in, kind of between Toronto and Georgian Bay, I think we're just pretty well done. Just the last wrap up of a few edible beans, and that's about it. So, and I think most of that corn's out of the ground and on its way. So, well ahead of normal.
How is the stand looking? I know some growers are faced with some replant decisions. What are you seeing in some of those stands on some of that early crop that's up?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. So, we had the early planting, which through this geography, I'm going to say represented maybe 60% of the corn acres. So a really aggressive start. And then, we had that bit of a break with some snow, and then the last 40% went in, and they all came out of the ground at the same time. But the early planting, we're sort of down maybe 10 to 15% on emergence. If you were dropping 34,000, we ended up with 30,000 final stands, and that's a bit bigger gap than normal. Obviously, a lot of leafing out underground, corkscrew effect, a few dead seeds along the way. But generally speaking, even at 30,000, depending on the hybrid and the setup plan that was in place, that's still full productivity for most cases. So I think we're in good shape. And the late seeded stuff, the stands are more like 98% and at the same stage as the first stuff. So right now it's all about weed control.
Yeah. So just before we get on to weeds, the replant decision for you, what's kind of that threshold that you're looking for in order to make that decision?
Well, I would be looking definitely anything down around the 20,000 mark. But to be honest, when you get into the lower heat unit zone here in Ontario, like we're down to even a 2,600 heat unit zone, so to speak, I'd be hard pressed to replant corn. By the 20th of May, I'd be eyeballing up a different strategy usually by that point in time. So we don't often replant corn to corn. We replant corn to something else, and fortunately we're not anywhere close to that situation. I'm definitely leaving stands of 25,000. Between 20 and 25, there'd be a lot of head scratching and kicking dirt, assessing the entire picture of where we're at.
Yeah, good point. Well, yeah. We're ahead of last year. That's we know that.
Oh yeah.
Are you seeing much crusting out there?
Yeah, a little bit. I think in general, there's usually every spring there's about a week where I spend every minute of my day, assessing stands particularly for soybeans and edible beans. But this year it's so far it's maybe been a half a dozen, 6 or 8 calls, and it was really situational. Some of those fields were right before that snow weekend, mid-May. On the soybeans, those soils pulled very tight, and we've lost some seed. It's just basically died off or rotted off in the ground. And of course, the slower these beans are to emerge, we get into wireworm feeding. Seed corn maggot is a big problem for us in this geography. So that eliminates quite a few plants on us if there's any delays on emergence. And then the other window was last Friday, more to do with the edible beans. We had a pounding rain go through, and some folks were right in the path of that. And we're just watching a few edible beans, hoping that we can get a successful stand there. But we're pretty fortunate. I'm really sheepish when I say that because we're not far enough along to really be out of the woods yet. But again, less than normal problems.
You're crossing your toes when you say all that.
I am.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned wireworms. I know out here in Western Canada, we're fighting a huge battle against wireworms in certain geographies this year. We had Scott Mears, entomologist from Alberta, on RealAg Live yesterday, and we talked about wireworms. You're seeing pretty big impacts there in Ontario as well?
Yes, we are. And I haven't had a lot of time to spend just sort of analyzing the whole picture, but every scout report that comes in, not every scout report, but probably 4 out of 5 will have wireworms listed at some pressure. When I'm out in a field, probably by the 3rd or 4th plant I've dug up, whether it's beans or corn, has wireworm at it. And that's not normal. That's well ahead of expectations for wireworm feeding. Usually those are isolated cases under specific conditions, hay plow downs, old sod, that sort of thing sort of sets you up for it. Sandy soils. These are on loams. These are on every different soil type and multiple crops. And that's beyond normal. Not a terrible amount of stand thinning, but enough that it's on the radar to keep track of for sure. And some of these bean fields, for example, will go to winter wheat in the fall or even a cereal next spring. So if the population's there, and a lot of them are juveniles, they're, half an inch long. They're not full size yet. So, we're definitely watching and keeping track of that pest.
The wheat, I know that you and I were chatting earlier. You said there's some yield in this year's wheat crop.
Yes, there is. It may not be the record crop, but it'll be certainly in the top 10, I think, even maybe top 5 for a lot of producers. And it's just, it's very uniform. There's not a lot of dead areas or kill out areas. We had a higher proportion of that wheat crop planted in optimum timing and optimum conditions. And all of that is very positive to productivity. And I work with a lot of clients that have imagery from, whatever sources, whether it's granular or field view. And I really like to watch those images right around flag leaf stage because they will often be a fairly strong mirror image of yield maps when we're done. And the higher degree of, positive canopy ratings in those fields is very optimistic. So like I said, we might not be the bin busters, but a lot of producers are, with the value of the wheat and the quality of the stands, they're testing new things and trying new things with higher N rates, with variable rate nitrogen, which is really a very tricky one to optimize in wheat because it's a hungry crop. It all needs nitrogen. And and even with the growth regulators and trying to find where is the sweet spot for nitrogen there. And kind of like what I see, we're learning as we go and everyone is searching for, we're all pretty satisfied with 100 bushel wheat crop. It's how do we get to 130 consistently and then 150 and I don't think we've quite got that pinned down yet, but we're definitely looking.
Have you seen some encouraging trials on variable rate nitrogen?
No.
Okay.
So to me, it's all about making sure the entire crop has enough nitrogen and then getting to the optimum amount in those specific zones. And in wheat, it's really, really difficult to know what that optimum amount is. And I've certainly had lots of scenarios where we have pushed nitrogen rates and trying to get that response. And, just because you go to 180 pounds of nitrogen or 200 pounds of nitrogen doesn't always get you to an extra 20 bushels. There's more to it than that. The entire package has to be there as the foundation. And just even trying to understand if nitrogen is not the limiting factor, or we're not getting the response purely from nitrogen, what is the missing step? And is it a micro? Is it stand establishment? Is it's generally not disease. These canopies are clean usually. So just trying to pin that down, and I'm coming to the conclusion it is more than just nitrogen. So, but that's where we're at today is still refining nitrogen. And I don't like getting responses back that tell me that we're behind 8 bushel over flat rate nitrogen. And that does still happen more often than we'd like. So we're still learning on that one.
I'm sure some people are asking or wondering about cereal leaf beetle. What have you been seeing there?
Well, I would say that critter is following a little bit of a different pattern here from what I'm observing, at least anyway. So we have a lot of spring grains and spring cereals, barley, oats, spring wheat through this geography. And we're finding feeding on, in some fields, we're finding feeding on 100% of the stems in oats, for example. And you can't find a single one of them in winter wheat, which is normally its classic feeding spot when it comes out of overwintering. That's where it heads to, is the winter wheat. But I suspect with the cold timeline that we had well into May, it sort of deferred them and pushed them back a little bit, and they've landed into the spring grains quite a heavy pressure. And so we're definitely monitoring them there. And yeah, you can hardly find them at all in the winter wheat, which is really, really good. But, for some producers, they've sprayed their winter wheat for cereal leaf beetle, probably 9 out of the last 10 years. So, and so far we can't hardly find them. So it's different.
Yeah. Well, and the other one that a lot of people are spraying for, and there isn't a lot of canola in Ontario, but flea beetles have just been brutal in parts of Western Canada. I hear you're experiencing the same thing in Ontario as well.
Yeah, we are. It's I always say that we categorize these insects, and they have certain behaviors and patterns and habits, but I there's always anomalies, and more often than you think, they just don't follow the rule book. And so yeah, we have intense pressures, and even to the point where the occasional producer is having to replant their canola because the pressure has been so aggressive. So the stand thinning is virtually 100%. So, and then you can have 2 fields beside each other, and one will be tremendous feeding, like extreme feeding, and the one adjacent to it will have minimal, not even 10% feeding on the leaves. So I wish I knew a little bit better how to predict those guys, but they do seem to run their own course, and we just have to be out there looking for them. And you can't just make those assumptions that if this one's clean, the next one is.
Do they have an appetite for soybeans at all?
No, not really. We get into a different flea beetle midsummer. It's a redheaded flea beetle, and it's like the giant of flea beetles. It's quite a bit bigger. And it can do a decent amount of leaf feeding. It'd be rare that we have to spray for it, but occasionally we will from a defoliation standpoint. It overlaps with pod fill, and that's usually a very critical time for soybeans.
Interesting.
Yeah,
it's with all these pests. We were talking to Scott Mears yesterday. And just how they kind of go in waves and cycles, and last year's non-concern can be this year's biggest threat. It's just you just have to stay on top of all of them when you're attacking the growing season.
Oh, exactly, and trying to be proactive on them, and I don't like having those scenarios where we're behind the 8 ball and having to maybe recover a stand that's already had too much feeding of some fashion, but there's some unusual cycles that happen, and you just can't always predict them. And I've been sending Tracy Bowdy pictures seemingly every day this week of bugs I have never seen before. And she's like, where are you finding these things? And and they're in fields in high numbers, which just you scratch your head and try to understand it better, and is it a factor or not? And that's the thing, the beauty of agronomy. There's no 2 days the same. There's no 2 seasons the same, and you're always learning.
I think the last pest I have on my list is aphids. What about those?
So we have, we're certainly having some hot spots of aphids in cereals in particular. And in my experience, when they're in the winter wheat crop, they it would take an awful lot to justify a spray in a winter wheat crop, but we do occasionally cross that threshold. But spring cereals, we almost always get close to or at threshold in spring cereals now, if they're not pre-treated with a neonic seed treatment, and a lot of producers have actually gotten to the point where they just pre-treat their seed with the neonics and proactively keep those aphids out as a management program. And that's about where we're at today. And so we're certainly, there's a lot more spring cereals in the ground this year. We had quite a few last year, and I'd say at least as much or more this year. There was some good value in cereal production coming into the spring. So we're definitely keeping an eye on them. And of course, these cereals are worth a little bit of money relative to some previous years and some of the other crops. So we're wanting to manage these pests as tightly as we can. And there's definitely some yield potential setting up in the spring grains as well. And aphids can rob yield. They seem like such a benign little pest, but
right.
they can cause a serious setback in oats, for example. And we have a lot of oats in the ground here in Ontario. So that's certainly a big concern.
Here comes one of Shaun's stupid questions, but does the populations of the cereal aphids early in the season, is that an indication at all what we could see with soybean aphids later on?
Generally, no. I would say there's not much correlation between the two. They're just completely different critters. But what does sort of help us on the plus side is that we get a buildup of the beneficial pests in the cereals. Namely the ladybird beetle, the ladybugs, and there's a whole slew of other beneficials. So we get them building up early in the season with ready available source of food. And then as those cereals start to ripen in July, when we potentially have higher risk of aphids coming into soybeans, we've already got the predators here in adjacent farms or fields or across roads, and that bodes well to keep them under control in soybeans if they do flourish there too. So, I would expect that we've already got the army here of beneficials ready to go if they do happen to show up.
Nice. Love those beneficials. Got to keep them in mind. Absolutely.
Yep.
They're working for us.
They are.
Let's move on to weed control. Of course, the growers that have IP soybeans, that is, it's always one of the biggest challenges is trying to make sure you don't have any big weed escapes. What are you seeing in terms of weed challenges here early in this growing season?
I'd say the first and foremost this spring, I don't know if I've had any scout reports come in that don't have perennial sow thistle on them. I don't know what the conditions were that have set that one up, but it's a very yield limiting weed. It certainly takes a lot of nutrients and out of the soil and water mainly, and it's so aggressive early on that it'll even kill out the crop beside it. So we're finding tremendous patches of perennial sow thistle. And if you're growing Roundup Ready corn, for example, that's not a big deal, or extend soybeans, you're ready set to be able to manage that weed with some dicamba perhaps. But in those IP soybeans, we don't have very good options for perennial weeds at all.
Yeah.
So, and of course they have to be up in order to control them. It's not something that we can, soil apply a product and have it keep it at bay. So you have to let that pressure come and try and hit that sweet spot before it kills out the crop, that you actually get some measure of control on it. And my advice to producers is don't scrimp on water volume, do not scrimp on rates, and you can suppress it for a reasonable period of time. It won't be perfect, but, somewhere in the neighborhood of 60%, suppression. I don't call it control, but try and, and let that crop get ahead of it. And where we're dealing with extreme pressures of this South Thistle, that you need a 5-year strategy. You need to be looking at ways to deal with that in all crops in the rotation and even in stubble. So, like I said, I don't know how that one has managed to set up the way it has for this year, but it's really intense in the field. So that's a big one. And fortunately, though, as far as the IPs go, we've had enough rain in, I think, just about every geography now to activate those soil applied chemistries. And first glance through at early emergence, the weed control's been pretty good. So other than those perennials that we're seeing, so that's a win. We'll take that one.
Yeah, and in terms of the dicamba beans, it seems like, if you compare it to 2 years ago, we were hearing so much about drift issues and things that growers were going through, and fights with neighbors. Ontario definitely didn't have some of the challenges that they had in the U.S., but it seems like that program's working fairly successfully in Ontario.
Maybe.
Are you seeing differently?
Yes, I am seeing differently.
Interesting. Okay.
I have a lot of calls annually on dicamba drift, and surprisingly, actually, we're using more dicamba in corn than we've probably used in a long time. And I think producers have heard the message on how to manage dicamba in soybeans very well, and they're fairly cautious about their approach to it. And somehow that message doesn't seem to resonate on the corn acre the same way. And so there have been some fairly significant dicamba drift scenarios in the last 2 years. It just doesn't get talked about in Ontario, maybe the way some other geographies, really get into litigation and things like that. So we try to deal with them locally and get them dealt with quickly and resolved as best possible and move on. So
do you have a theory on why some of the best management practices that have been implemented in soybeans wouldn't have carried through or carried over to when we're talking about corn? What would be the reason behind that?
Well, a couple things come to mind. We've worked, we're often spraying corn at that, let's call it 3 to 5 leaf stage. And that's often, 5th, 10th, 15th of June. So that's a high risk window for a drift scenario. Often we're using the dicamba earlier in a burn down, let's say, in those extend soybeans. So we got a little bit of a differential on the timeline. But again, it's not really resonating that we're maybe moving in, once you get to mid-June, you've got warmer temperatures, warmer soil temperatures, dews, weather factors that you don't necessarily have in May. So that I think is part of it. And the messaging that's very loud and clear in the extend soybeans has been very well received. I think most producers are quite aware. Most crop advisors are quite aware of how to use it in beans. But we also have a group of crop advisors that dicamba is a new product. And like it's a completely new product to them that maybe prior to 3 years ago, they'd never worked with. And, and again, all that messaging reinforcing how to use it in soybeans was there, but that it should have been, and I've made it known to several reps in the industry that we need to carry that over into corn equally as much, because that seems to be where the gap is, and those younger reps, for example, wouldn't have that history in corn the way some of us with gray hair have. So
oh,
we've
come on.
used it forever and a day, it seems, in corn, and it's old hat. But for certainly for a group of people, it's brand new chemistry for reps and farmers alike. So
yeah. Well, hey, we've heard stories, and more like you alluded to, more so north or south of the border, on certain other crops like raspberry. When it moves, and it can just be devastating. So
yes.
we need to be following best management practices to minimize that drift as much as possible. Sticking with spraying, you want to talk about water volume.
So we're coming into some post-emerge spraying here now, and also for we're looking at a fungicide pass here imminently. Certainly in the southwest of Ontario, they've started with their heading sprays on wheat. So we're, generally speaking, I moved to higher water volumes as a general practice in a bunch of these post-emerge sprays. Certainly with fungicides, that's the norm. Quite often in that 20 gallon rate. But even on post-emerge sprays and soybeans, again, going back to some of that conventional chemistry, Reflex or Bazagran or any of those types of products. And even a product like Classic, it's mobile in the plant, but we want to have it as easily and as best possible moving to every growing point on a plant like sow thistle. So that usually involves water volume and getting as good a coverage as possible. So it's just kind of a reminder to, we need efficiency. I'm all for that too, absolutely. But we want to prevent a bunch of respraying and lack of efficacy in these products as best possible too.
Do you see water volume skimping as something that is, where you mentioned the word efficiency, where it's like, if I cut the volume a little bit, I'm going to be able to get X amount of more acres done in a day? Does that kind of depend on year to year?
Well, it's funny. I'm going to make it funny, but at the end of the day, it's not so funny. But water volume is a negotiation. Deb says 20 gallon, and the grower says, well, how about 15? Can I do it with 15? And then if I say 25 gallon, well, can I do it with 18? And, and obviously there's more to it. It's nozzle selection and all that kind of stuff, and time of day sometimes too. But somehow water volume's negotiable. So I start high. I've learned to start high on water volumes.
It's sort of like when you're trying to sell an RV. You start high and you try to end up at the price you were looking for originally.
Yeah. And I don't mean to make light of it or anything, but that water volume is so underestimated in the efficacy of products that we spray. And, the trade-off is efficiency. There's no question. And I understand that. But you're not being efficient if you have to come in and respray a 30-year crop. You win some, lose some there. So I like to do it right in the first place.
Yeah. There was another topic I wanted to cover in spraying. I think it had to do with sprayer cleanout in terms of, I'm sure there's many fields you get called out to where it's like, what exactly happened here? And it's like, oh, maybe we didn't clean out the sprayer as well as we first thought.
Yeah. We're in that intense spray window where we're moving from corn to beans, to edible beans, and back to wheat heading sprays, and full circle with glyphosate in various tank mixes. And it is the most critical. It's always a critical item, but with that much going on, it is so critical to be on top of on that cleaning program, sprayer cleanout program, and cutting corners there. Just it is high risk. So the triple rinsing, using cleaners where it's recommended, and there's nothing worse than damaging your own crop just from a lack of boom cleanout or tip cleanout or whatever the case might be. So and I know those sprayer guys, those folks get exhausted at the end of this 2-week period going through wheat, but it really matters. And so it's just it's about awareness and keeping your wits about you and just being meticulous from start to finish every time.
Well, to put it in perspective, I got a tweet earlier today from he's a Manitoba-based farmer. He's tweeting at @T_Bartman, and he was giving me an update on his crop conditions. And Tyler said that he's actually spent already this spring 250 hours in the sprayer.
Yeah, wow. Yep, it's intense, and it is the number one machine on farms for a reason, and it's a phenomenal tool in crop management. But it comes with that extra. It needs a lot of management to optimize that tool, and especially in the next 14 days as we move from crop to crop. So yeah, just need to be diligent on those cleanouts, and especially on heading wheat. There's no room for error.
Any last thoughts you have, Deb? Things you want to make sure that growers hear before we go?
I'm just, I was about as positive as I can be on the first week of June. I think we're in a really good place from an agronomic standpoint, with not a lot of big issues, a lot of little picky issues, one-offs that are happening around the countryside. But, I think there's a lot of potential in this crop, and, hopefully folks have a plan in place to be able to succeed on that.
We're still pretty close to the optimal yield curve, are we not?
Oh, I would say so. I'd say we're well on it, and looking forward in the next 2 weeks, I know our crew gets very busy at soil nitrate sampling, and trying to get a handle on where we're at with soil nitrogen, and are we needing more? Are we needing less? Can we manage particularly in corn, can we manage nitrogen a little bit differently or optimize it a little bit more? And that's a critical window when we get to that 6 or 8 leaf corn, to have a really good handle on your nutrient status going into that rapid growth phase. So, just one more way to monitor and manage in season, and hopefully reach that grain fill window with a top end yield potential. So we just don't stop managing it. It seems it's from start to finish all the way through when the combine gets there. So
what's the ideal time for that tissue test on the corn for the nitrate testing?
Well, so the nitrate testing is the soil test, and the 12-inch soil test we do here in Ontario. Okay. I think maybe they go a little bit deeper in Western Canada, but so we're aiming to do that roughly at 6 to 8 leaf corn. I like to wait for that window where everybody runs out and cuts their hay for dry hay, because they know they have a 5-day sunny forecast. That's usually a good window because, well, it's warm, it's sunny, and adequate moisture usually, and all of that bodes well for microbial activity in the soil, and to me gives us as good a reading as we're going to get for soil nitrate. So I like to do that in that 6 to 8 leaf window to get that snapshot of where we're at with nitrogen, and then we can sort of massage that data from there. Do they still have manure to mineralize? What is the potential of this crop by the time we get to the end of June, that sort of thing. And the tissue testing, there's multiple windows throughout the season. I like to do it at that 6 to 8 leaf window. I'm in the field anyway. I'm reading the soil nitrogen, so having a good handle on plant nutrient status is a good window as well. And quite often I might do that again, just pre-tasseling. It's again another window where you might top up on a nutrient standpoint as well if it was lacking. So just try to hit those critical production windows is what we're aiming for.
Awesome stuff. Hey, Deb, if somebody wants more information from you, how do they get a hold of you?
So my email, deb.campbell@agronomyadvantage.com. And if all else fails, they can find me on my website at Agronomy Advantage.
Perfect. Awesome stuff. Hey, tomorrow's RealAg Live guest is going to be John Barlow. He is the Shadow Minister for Agriculture and Agri-Food with the Conservative Party. We're going to talk ag policy with John from Ottawa, so that's going to be a lot of fun. Hey, Deb, I really appreciate you joining us here today on RealAg Live.
Thanks, Shaun. It was fun.
Okay, thanks everybody for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live, and we'll be back on tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 o'clock Central, or 1 o'clock Mountain for all of you time zone geeks out there. Have a great night, everybody. Cheers.